Anyway, I want to talk about what's going to process a bird photo, and then I thought I'd expand that a bit to um, the vision in this case is going to be more sort of general discussion or some general information on shooting birds, um, not specific to the one image that I'll process. The one image I process is essentially just going to be an example of uh, how to process kind of any bird photo. Um, Welcome, Paul. So
Hi.
um, for photographing birds, you don't necessarily need a lot of special equipment. It helps to have somewhat of a longer lens, telephoto lens, because generally birds are a little distance from you. They usually don't let you get too close unless they're pretty used to humans being around. I mean, we've seen photos of people that have had a little chickadee or something land on their finger, but uh, can't always count on that. So, use the longest lens, and I say longest lens you can comfortably handle. This kind of ties into the second point that in some cases you might want to use a tripod, particularly if the birds are perched or floating in the water. But certainly, if you're going to try to shoot birds in flight, it's hard to do that from a tripod unless you have a gimbal. Handheld is generally better. But when I say longest lens you can comfortably handle, that kind of relates to the weight of the lens. I typically use a 1 to 400 millimeter
Mhm.
lens, and that's not too bad, but it can get a little tiring holding that up for a long period of time. I also have a Sigma 150 to 600, which is quite a bit heavier, and to try to shoot birds in flight with that would be quite difficult because of the weight and the heft of the lens. So, um,
It,
and when shooting birds, particularly if you can, like if they're in the water, um, and this kind of goes for a lot of this stuff goes for any wildlife photography, but today I'm talking specifically birds. Try to get down to eye level with the bird if you can. So if they're swimming in a pond, the lower you can get your camera down so that you're kind of looking across at them rather than looking down on them. You'll tend to get slightly better shots. You get more of a background than just the bird, kind of looking down on the bird and it's just surrounded by water. If you can get down at eye level, you're going to get a little more of the environment that it's in. Critical for shooting birds is shutter speed. Um, for birds at rest, um, you can get away with perhaps 1/800th or 1,000th. Um, Keeping in mind, those speeds are good because with considering if you're shooting like with a 400 millimeter lens, remember the inverse rule where your minimum shutter speed should be at least 1/400 or 1 over the focal length of the lens. Um, so at the very minimum, if you're using a 400 millimeter lens, you should be the minimum speed would be 1/400th, but 1/800th to 1,000th is probably pretty good for most birds if they're perched on something or swimming in the water. For a bird in flight, because you want to try to, if you can, freeze the movement of the wings and the movement of the bird, you're going to need a faster shutter speed. So, 1/2000th, even 1/4000th of a second to try to freeze that motion.
Neil,
Yep.
we have a place down in Mexico on the coast, and I've often tried to shoot pelicans in flight. but especially as they do their dive for their food. And I don't know what speed they're going at, but even at a 2,000th of a second, I can't stop them. So yeah, and I'm shooting at a 400 millimeter also.
Yeah. Yeah. Birds in flight are, I would suggest starting with shooting birds at rest. And when you that, birds in flight, I'm still struggling. I'm starting to get some decent shots of birds in flight, but it's
But if
takes
if
a
you
lot of
use
practice.
if you use burst mode as well, that helps.
Yeah, I'll
Yes,
get to that.
absolutely.
That's sort of my last point. Um,
The only negative of that is when you go to process them and you've got 500 shots.
Yeah. And I've tried over the years. I've used different settings. I originally, when I started shooting birds or wildlife, I started off using shutter speed priority, and so you could set faster shutter speed. But the problem with that is it doesn't let you control your depth of field. And I kind of like, unless I'm shooting an environmental shot, I kind of like to have a somewhat blurred background and have the bird in focus. So then I started using aperture priority, which allows me to control the depth of field much better. You're doing that, you just have to keep in mind or keep checking what the camera is calculating for your shutter speed. Again, if you're not paying attention to it, you can have a nice blurred background, but your camera, if it's now calculating a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, you might also have a very blurry bird. So you have to, if you're shooting either shutter speed or aperture priority, of course, generally going to want a higher ISO, 800 or 1,000.
Neil, what do you think about using auto ISO in that case?
I'll get to that in my next
Okay,
point.
sorry.
What I've started using in the last couple of months, and I've heard of people recommending this several times over the last couple of years. I'd sort of tried it once or twice and then gone back to shooting aperture priority. But now what I tend to do is go into manual mode on the camera. I set the aperture to whatever depth of field I want. So, generally, if I want the blurred background, then I'm shooting at whatever the minimum or widest open exposure or aperture, pardon me, that the lens will allow. Like for the 1 to 400, if I'm shooting at 400, the widest open I can shoot is f/5.6. If I have my 1.4 converter on it, the widest open I can shoot is f/8. But if I want more of an environmental shot where I want the background in focus, then I'm going to be shooting, f/11, f/16, somewhere in there. So you set your aperture to control the depth of field. You set your shutter speed. So if I'm shooting birds in the water, I might set the shutter speed at 1,000. And then I set the ISO to automatic. And doing that, then I control the shutter speed, I control the depth of field. The camera automatically adjusts the ISO to give me an image that has that, shutter speed and the depth of field. So it's sort of the best of both worlds.
Mhm.
It also, your ISO can change on every shot, sort of thing, but that's fine. And quite often you'll end up with a high ISO, and you may start getting noise as a result. But software now is so good at eliminating noise that unless if you're shooting in low light, then the camera is going to be setting a really high ISO, and you're probably going to get lots of noise. But if you're shooting, early morning, mid-morning, middle of the day, it's probably going to be lots of light, and yeah, your ISO might get up to 1600 or 1000, 3200, whatever. You get a bit of noise, but again, you can probably um, easily clean that up in post. And then finally, of course, use burst mode, and you'll end up. I mean, I can go out shooting in the morning for an hour, a couple hours, and come back with 2,000 photos easily.
Yeah.
And out of that, I usually try to get it down to 1 or 2 images per species of bird. So if all I see are mallards and they shoot off 1,500 shots of mallards, I'll get it down to 1 shot or 2 shots. If I see 8 different birds, then it'll be 1 or 2 shots of each kind of bird. Okay.
Well, I've got a question on burst mode. A lot of the newer cameras, I think, besides what I'll call the manual burst mode or whatever that might set it at 10, 12, whatever it sets that, some of them have an electronic factor that can really up that. I wondered if anyone's ever used that. Like
on the mirrorless cameras, you mean?
Pardon me?
On the mirrorless cameras.
Yeah.
I don't have a mirrorless, so I don't have experience with that, but
I do, but I haven't used that feature. I'm kind of afraid of it. I don't know what it's going to do. So
our Nikon, even in their DSLRs, has an electronic shutter, and I don't know anything about what that does for the burst speed, but I have used it before just to reduce any sort of shake or anything like that in the camera.
all right.
And I don't, all it does is turn the sensor on and off. So, and nothing else is really kind of moving. So it's,
All right.
it seems pretty simple to me.
it'd be worth trying it anyway.
Sure. Yeah. I've just
In terms of taking a shot, you're out on site and you found a bird that you want to photograph. I'd say kind of one of the most important guidelines is to focus on the eye. That's really and it's the same as if you're taking portraits of people, you generally focus on the eye. With birds, with any wildlife, same thing. It's sort of the saying, if you miss the eye, you miss the shot. It's kind of, the wings are in focus, but the eyes are blurred. It's not going to be a particularly attractive image unless there's some real special look that you're trying to achieve. So focus on the eye. Don't worry too much if some of the rest of the bird is a little bit out of focus. It'll still, may be a usable shot. Probably the biggest thing you'll learn shooting birds is patience. Your odds of, wandering by a pond, taking 1 shot and coming home with a keeper is pretty low. It might happen. Chances are that it won't. I'll sometimes find a spot along by the water. I'll sit there, for an hour, 2 hours, and just shoot what lands in front of me. And another thing to keep in mind is birds are easily, they're skitterish. They may be swimming around in the water, but they're probably aware that you're there. So it's best to kind of approach them slowly. I'll sometimes approach a pond, start taking a few images, wait a few minutes, let the birds kind of get used to me being there. Then I might move ahead a foot or 2 feet or whatever. If I'm down on my knees, crawl ahead a foot or 2 feet, take some more shots, gradually, work my way up closer to the water, hoping that, in the meantime, the birds are not getting too skitterish and moving away or flying away. And while you're there, observe their behavior, because that'll also help you get some decent shots. If they're in trees or landing on bulrushes or something, do they always return to the same perch? You see a bird flying away, and a minute later, 2 minutes later, it comes back to the very same spot or the very same branch. That can kind of help you plan a shot. If you want to catch it landing, if you wait a few minutes, keep an eye open, you may see the bird starting to fly back towards you. You can kind of line up a shot, and you may get a nice shot of it landing. I remember last summer, the summer before, I was out in kind of a wetland area, and I noticed this female red-winged blackbird that every few minutes she would fly away, and a few minutes later she'd come back with a mouthful of bugs and dragonflies and whatever, and land on a bulrush, and she'd perch there for a moment or two, and then she would kind of fly down into the bulrushes, presumably or cattails, presumably where her nest was. And then I'd see her fly away, and a few minutes later she'd be back. So that's pretty much that same cattail, perch on it with her mouth full of bugs and look around. And so it was quite easy to get a few shots of her with a mouthful of bugs, because I knew exactly where she was going to keep coming back to. So also, you can take a note of what direction they take off. If they're on the water or even in trees, generally birds will, like airplanes, will take off into the wind. So if you can maneuver yourself to where you're upwind from them, you may catch them taking off, coming straight at you. Are there any repetitive motions they make while they're perched or swimming? You'll maybe see them kind of rise up out of the water and flap their wings, doing whatever it is, making a display or drying their wings or whatever. If you notice that they do that, then again, kind of get ready, and then when they start to do it, you're ready to take some shots of it. And also, while you're there, kind of be aware of the background, be aware of the lighting. Generally speaking, if you can get the animal or the bird side lit or front lit, it'll give you a little better results than if you try to shoot into the sun. You're probably going to get a silhouette of the bird. With the exception of early morning when the sun's pretty light or low and the light's nice and soft, you can get some nice golden glow around the bird. There's enough light on the bird, and a little bit of backlighting can make a really nice shot. So be aware of the lighting, and if you can, move around to a spot where the lighting, you can get a better angle on the birds, considering where the light is coming from.
Neil,
Yep.
That picture of yours with the bird where you can see the breath, had you observed that before, or was that pure chance that you caught that?
No, I had taken some shots of that. It was a red-winged blackbird perched on a cattail, and took a couple shots. And then I was looking at it again through my viewfinder while I was lining up another shot, and I noticed the breath coming out. So that's when I kind of watched and waited for it to start singing. It was, as soon as it opened its mouth and started singing, of course, then the breath comes out. So again, that came as a result of a bit of luck, but also kind of paying attention to what the bird was doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then, you come home with 2,000 images of birds. How do you pare it down? First of all, my own workflow is I load the images onto a file in my laptop, and then I go through them using Bridge. There's other software programs out there that allow you to quickly go through a batch of images and rate them or eliminate certain ones of them. So I tend to do all my paring down or try to get it down to a minimum number of images before I import them into Lightroom. So in my case, as I mentioned, I use Bridge, but there's other programs out there you can use. So as I'm going through, things I'm looking for obviously are for birds that, want the shot in focus, or at least the bird in focus, and especially the eye. In terms of sharpness, if there's a little bit of blur in the wings, that's not necessarily a killer, because that can kind of suggest a little bit of motion,
Sure.
particularly if the bird's flying. So I also look for a catch light in the eye. As you know, catch light is just a little bit speck of light in the human eye, anybody's, any animal's eye. If it's there, it just tends to make it makes whatever you're shooting, makes them look a little more alive than if there's no light in the eye looks kind of dead, the image looks kind of dead. But if there's a little bit of, it's surprising what a difference just that little speck of light in the eye makes. Interestingly, the Mount Rushmore, when we were there in the museum there, they had a replica of, it's like this big stone 4x4 or whatever that is actually coming out of the pupil of Lincoln's eye on the mountain. And the idea is when the sun shines on that little bit of or that chunk of rock coming out of his pupil, it creates a little reflection and creates a catch light in the eye. So they've, on a carving on a mountain, they've thought of creating a catch light in an eye. I thought that was kind of interesting. Anyway, in terms of what I look for in the bird itself, portraits can be nice. And by portrait, I just mean kind of a bird perched somewhere, just sitting, not really doing anything. It'd be kind of nice, it shows the color and the characteristics of the bird and so on. But a much more interesting shot is usually the bird doing something, singing with its mouth open, flying, landing, about to take off, flapping its wings. It's got a mouthful of bugs, feeding its young. Anything that kind of tells a story or gives you a little more information about the bird is preferable to just the shot of a bird sitting there doing nothing. Like I say, portraits can be nice, but if you can get other kinds of shots of that bird, it's just all that much more interesting.
Neil, you said you used Bridge rather than Lightroom.
Yep.
And
for my culling of the images, and then
yeah,
once I'm down to my final selection, then I import that into Lightroom.
Oh, okay. And so, can you tell me why you prefer Bridge over Lightroom?
A couple of reasons. It's a lot faster. It's very quick to go through images. Also, when I import into Lightroom, I import images into sort of a working file, and those are the images I'm going to process. At the same time, and it's an option you can choose in Lightroom, I import those same raw files into another folder and that's my sort of my backup. So I never touch those raw
Good job.
files in that folder unless something happens to corrupt my working file. Then I still have a clean copy of the original raw file. So if I've got 2,000 images of birds and I'm importing them into Lightroom, I'm also importing 2,000 raw files into my raw file folder. And as I mentioned, I never touch that. So now I've got 2,000 images. Sure, if I use Lightroom, I can cull those 2,000 images that are in my working file. I can get that down to, maybe 10 images or 5 images or 20 images. But I've still got those 2,000 images sitting in that other file, which takes up a lot of storage space. So it's merely a means of not creating my, not building up, not unnecessarily building the size of my sort of cold storage of raw files.
In Bridge, does Bridge have the ability to mark images as rejects and then?
Yep. Yeah.
Just like Lightroom where you
Yeah.
do
And
an X.
actually, if you
Yeah.
rate them in Bridge, Lightroom will import that rating into Lightroom.
Okay.
Okay.
If I have time, actually, I've got a few images that I stuck in the folder in Bridge, and I can just quickly show you how I cull them. But so just carrying on, I look for backgrounds that are kind of working with the image. Sometimes you'll see something where the bird, the background is just too busy. The bird kind of blends into it. There's probably not a lot of, it's probably not worth a lot of time trying to process that because it's going to be really hard to make the bird stand out from the background. Unless you really wanted it as an environmental shot to say, look how well this bird is camouflaged. But generally, that's not what I'm after. And also consider the distractions. So again, as I'm going through them, if there's something that's kind of, obliterating half the bird, like there's a branch that got in the way, it's just not going to be worth spending hours in Lightroom Photoshop trying to remove that that branch. But other little distractions that you recognize are going to be easy to remove, then that doesn't necessarily eliminate the image. So if you're kind of going through the image, bunch of images, looking at all these things and trying to pick out those that are kind of worthwhile spending your time editing. Oh, sorry, Paul, one thing I was going to say, even when I get them into Lightroom, sometimes, again, as you start going through them in Lightroom, you'll come across one and say, that's just not worth spending my time on. And I may either keep it but just not process it, or I may delete it. If I delete it from my working file, I don't go into my cold storage file and try to find it. So even if I've deleted it from my working file, it's still going to be in my cold storage. So again, that's why I want to keep what I'm putting into cold storage to a minimum, so I'm not using up a lot of storage space unnecessarily. So just quickly looking at a few images. This is kind of what I would refer to as a portrait shot. It's a robin standing there. It's not doing anything. It's, he's posing nicely. He's got a nice catch light, kind of a nice profile view of the robin. It's a nice shot, but it would have much more of a story to it if the robin had a worm in its mouth, or had its mouth open singing, or was flapping its wings or doing something. But as a portrait, it's it's a nice enough shot. So here's a female red-winged blackbird singing. A little more of a story to this one than the previous one, which is just a bird sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
Or a bird in flight. I think in this case, she's probably just jumped off of the cattail and started to fly. A little more of a story to that. Another kind of portrait shot of a
Chickadee.
cap chickadee. A little more of a story to this one.
Mm-hmm.
This is one I'm actually going to process later. A bird, widgeon, American widgeon, taking off from a pond. A tree swallow in flight. This one I kind of like. That tells a little bit of story. It's like the one tree swallow flying up, kind of asking the other one, is there enough room up there for me? The other one's kind of got his head turned and checking just to see. This one is a bit of an environmental shot. So rather than going in tight on the goose landing on the water, including a bit of a background, just kind of shows the, that it's, the environment that it's landing in. Bird in flight, kind of a very simple image against a fairly blue sky. Redneck grebe building a nest in the water. And two of them yakking at each other. So this is the image I want to just kind of go through some processing on, just to show some of the steps that I typically take. Of course, every image is unique and you may process it a little bit differently, but in general, if the original shot is, if it's well shot, well exposed, with bird images, often you don't have to do a whole lot of processing, because you don't necessarily want to change a lot. You want the bird to appear somewhat natural, somewhat normal. Landscapes, sometimes you get a little more creative with how you want the landscape and the sky and everything else to appear, whether you saturate it or desaturate it, all those kinds of things. With birds, at least when I'm processing birds, I'm trying to get them to look, as natural as possible. So if the original shot is pretty good, probably doesn't take a lot of processing. What I try to do is just kind of my general approach is to do what I can to make the bird stand out from the background a little bit, so that obviously your eye goes straight to the bird and hopefully not too many distractions in the background. Usually one of the first things I do, and with most bird shots, you're probably, unless if you really got lucky with a bird a few feet from you, you're probably going to have to crop it. In this case, a lot of my shots, I kind of like 4x5 crops, but you can crop it any way you want. A vertical crop in this particular image kind of works a little better for me anyway, because it is a bird taking off.
Mm-hmm.
With birds, as with a lot of other subjects, you don't want to crop in too tight so it looks like it's constrained. Particularly for a bird in flight, you want to have room on the side of the image, the direction the bird is flying into, to give a sense of, space that the bird is moving into something. This wouldn't be a particularly good crop. It looks like, the bird's just about to fly out of the image, but, there's nowhere there for the bird to
Go.
really to fly. So giving a sense that he's lifting off, he's got some room to fly, but cropping in tight enough that you can see a good image of the bird. Then quite often I start with calibration, the calibration tab in Lightroom, and probably add a little bit of saturation, desaturate the reds. You can see how the background becomes pretty blah. If I add some red saturation, and adds a little bit more color to the background, also adds a little more color into the
Bird.
side of the bird. It's blue, yeah. Increase the blue a little bit. Adds a little more color in the background as well. A little more in the greens there. Add a little bit more green. Yeah. Actually, probably decrease the green. Increase the green, or pardon me, the blue. That makes more sense. Increase the blue and start to get a lot of blue in the white of his feathers, which I really don't want. So actually take some blue out of the image. Then go into the basic panel and adjust the whites. Can't adjust it too much before you start blowing out the wing there. Give a little bit of contrast by increasing the blacks or moving the black slider to the left. Open up the shadows, because there's, the bird is a little bit in the shadow. The sun is a little more overhead, so opening up the shadows, you can see that it, if I go the other way, it darkens the bird. If I open up the shadows, you can see a little more detail in the bird. Highlights. Probably reduce the highlights a little bit. And exposure actually isn't too bad the way it is. I'm going to do a couple of other things with exposure. I may warm up the image just a slight bit. To me, there's sort of a bright area up at the top of the image that I'm going to use a gradient mask or a gradient tool to deal with. So just bring gradient down from the top, and I can darken that a little bit, down the highlights. And then I'll use the range mask, use luminance, and protect the darker parts. So by sliding the left-hand arrow or left-hand caret to the right, you can see that it's masking out the dark parts of the background, and really it's applying that darkening just to the brighter parts of the background. And I may also do something similar from the bottom. Bring up a gradient from the bottom and just reduce exposure, just a very slight amount. Again, what I'm trying to do is again, make the bird stand out from the background. So I don't want the background so bright that it's, distracting, obviously. So I'm just doing a few things just to kind of bring down the brightness of the background. I can use a radial filter on the bird. And so on the bird, I'm going to try to lighten him up a little bit. I can further, don't want to do too much for the shadows. I don't want to wash out the bird, but bring up the whites a little bit, bring down the blacks. And again, I'm going to use the range mask, use a luminance slider. And this time I want the effect to apply more to the darker parts of the bird. That's really what I was trying to bring out. The lighter parts of the bird are already light enough. So I'm going to this time bring the right-hand slider down. And as you can see, as I'm doing that, it's masking out the bright parts of the bird and just applying the change to the darker parts of the bird. And a bit of the background is also getting affected, but that's brought the bird out a little bit more. And if all you wanted to do was edit in this Lightroom, it's probably a reasonably decent shot as it stands right now. You could add a bit of a vignette to it. One way of doing that is using another radial filter around the bird. This is, of course, a little bit slower when you're on Zoom. And just have to make sure that you click the invert, because as it is now, anything I adjust is going to adjust inside the circle. So if I click invert, it's now going to adjust outside the circle. And I can bring down the exposure a little bit. Feathering doesn't look too badly. Could even increase the feathering a bit though. So that's not too bad.
Nice.
That's what I started from. And that's where I got to. But there's a few more things I would do to this. And to do that, I'd take it into Photoshop. And I generally open these as smart objects in Photoshop. So if you right click and choose edit, and then down at the bottom or towards the bottom, you'll see an option that says open as a smart object in Photoshop. I'm going to talk in, I think it's 3 weeks time, a lot more about smart objects and what they are and why they're worthwhile using. But so I'll just leave it at this point that I would open as a smart object in Photoshop. And I already have opened one, not the same processing, but very similar to the way I just processed that one, but without the vignette on it. Sorry, this one. So there's my layer, smart object layer there. And the first thing I would do, because a couple of things I want to do is I want to be able to adjust the bird separately from the background. So first thing I would do is actually make a selection of the bird. And Photoshop, I don't know, it was maybe a year ago, sometime within the last year, brought out this object selection tool. So it's under the same tab as the quick select tool, but it's the object selection tool. And actually, if it works really well. And it's a fast way of selecting. So you just kind of draw a box around the object you want to select. It takes a moment and zoom even longer. And ultimately it should, in zoom, it might take a lot longer. It should make a decent selection of that bird. Okay, there we go. So you can see the marching ants, and it's actually done a pretty good job of selecting the bird. You can go back to the quick select tool and maybe do a little fine tuning on that. So it's selected too much of the background up here. Need to select a little more of the bird's breast there. That's not too bad. And then if you go into the select and mask,
Lost some of his wing.
Yeah.
yeah, didn't choose a lot of the wing, but I can add that in. There we go. That was using the, over on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can, it shows up on your screen. Just lost
How about
my
it?
cursor.
How about his left foot deal?
I'm going to clean that up in a second if I can get my cursor to go back on that screen. There it is. Okay. It's still thinking. That's the problem. Okay, using the refine edge tool. When Zoom actually allows me to get back onto Photoshop. Oh, there we go. No, it's still thinking.
It's also missing a little bit of its tail feathers.
Yeah, that's where the refine edge tool, if I can get to it.
Oh, I see.
Okay, refine edge brush, selected. Now I can go on there and further refine that selection to include those missing bits, the little bit, the tips of the feather and so on. This is working really slowly in Zoom, so I'm not going to refine this any further because I do have another image I've got it saved. So I just click OK. And wait for it in Zoom. Okay, this is getting a little frustrating.
Getting there though.
Getting there, yeah. Still thinking. Still thinking.
Thinks about as fast as I do.
when it never lets me close out this window, it'll actually save this selection. Something in Photoshop, often if you're making a selection of something, it's worthwhile saving it so that you don't have to reselect it and go through all of this again. Oh, this is slow. There we go, I think. Okay. That's interesting.
What does the term dither signify in this?
There we go.
I think it's kind of like rendering or it's thinking or whatever. Anyway, okay, you can see the marching ants.
Yeah.
Under select, I think it is, you have an option to save selection. Opens up a window. I'll name this bird. And I now have a selection of that bird that I can go back to anytime. I don't have to go through all of that again. So I've got a selection of the bird. So if I want, I can separate the bird from the background and from some of the effects. And the other thing I want to do is take this into Topaz Sharpen to sharpen up the bird a bit. So Sharpen AI. I'm not going to do that round trip because it would probably take us until after supper time with Zoom for it to work. But I do have another version of this image where what I did was, going back to the first one, there's my smart object.
Yeah.
Before I go into AI Sharpen, I want to create a copy of that smart object. But I want to, and I'll talk about this more when I talk about smart objects in a few weeks, but I would choose, where is it here? Create, what I want is create, new smart object via copy. So I'll explain further the difference between simply duplicating that layer like you normally do, Control J or duplicate layer. In this case, I want to create a new smart object via copy. So now I've got two copies of the same smart object there. And using that top layer, top smart object, sorry, go back to this one, using that top smart object, I would then go up to Filter, down to Topaz Labs, and select Topaz Sharpen AI. That would take it into Sharpen AI. In this case, I think I used the focus, focus selection in Sharpen AI. That seemed to give me the best results. And when I bring it back from Topaz into Photoshop, it creates this smart filter layer down here. So there's the Topaz Sharpen. Blow it up a little bit. It may be kind of, I don't know how well you're going to see it on Zoom.
Looks pretty good.
It's very subtle, but it did a pretty nice job of sharpening up the bird, and also reduced a bit of noise on the bird. In this case, it didn't make a lot of difference to the background, but just to make sure, I really don't want the background sharp, and I want the bird sharp, but I don't necessarily want the background sharp. So that's where I can use that mask I created. One way of getting there is to go into your channels panel, and down there you can see the selection of the bird I made. So if I use control and, oops, sorry, control and click on that, you see the marching ants there. It's created a selection of that bird. And if I click on the layer mask button at the bottom, it creates a layer mask with that bird automatically selected. So now that sharpening is only being applied to the bird. Okay, I'm not going to do a lot more to this. I can use a hue saturation layer just to maybe bring out the color on the side of the bird a little bit. And if I actually clip this layer to the one below, so you can use the Alt key and kind of hover over the dividing line between the two layers, you'll see it creates a little square with a downward arrow there. It means whatever, by clipping it to that layer, it means whatever I'm doing with that hue saturation is only going to affect the layer below it. And in this case, the layer below it already has that mask applied for the bird. So it's only going to make this change to the bird. So if I go really crazy with oh, there, for some reason it just created or clicked or chose the cyans. But if I go crazy, you can see that it's boosting the cyans in the bird, but it's not doing anything to the background. That's because the background's already been masked out. So it's subtle, but I think that was in the reds. There. So you can see it brought out the red in the side of the bird a little bit. I can always adjust the opacity just to bring that down a bit. What else I might want to do? I can create a use a curves layer, maybe brighten up the bird a little bit. That brightened up everything, but again, I can click on the layer mask down here that's already selecting the bird, use the alternate key, click on the mask, drag it up, and it will copy that layer mask onto the curves layer just created. And now you can see that that brightening is only applying to the bird. So, okay, in the interest of time, I'm not going to do a lot more to this image. There's a few more things I could play around with just to further enhance the bird and separate it from the background. Could do a little dodging and burning on the bird just to try to give it a little bit of shape. Well, one more thing just to show you. There is already a catch light in the bird's eye. You can see it, the white part of the eye. If you want to enhance that, one way of doing it is just to, again, use a curves layer. Jack it up. You can even make it even brighter by choosing something like screen blend mode. And of course that brightens up, washes out everything. But if I change that to a black mask and zoom in a little bit with a white brush, I can just paint that effect, just brighten up that catch light a little bit. And then it's best to kind of zoom out a little bit. You don't want, you don't want the bird's eye glowing, particularly looks like it's something out of an alien movie. So you can adjust the opacity a little bit just to make it look natural, but just, enhance it so that catch light really stands out.
Mhm.
And then finish it off with a vignette. I like to use, or I like to create my own vignette or shape of vignette. To do that, I use the lasso tool and just draw shape around the bird or whatever object you're wanting to create the vignette around. And Tony Kuiper's panel, those that have it, makes it really easy. He has a selection that says, or an action that says freehand vignette. Click on that. You choose you choose how much you want that vignette blurred, and presto, you've got a vignette. If you can turn it off and on, you can see that there's been a vignette applied, and I've controlled exactly where I want that vignette to be. If you don't have Tony Kuiper's panel, it's still really easy to do this. Use the lasso tool, draw around the bird, go to, or if you don't have Tony Kuiper's panel, you go down the bottom here, select your curves adjustment, and you'll notice that it's already created that mask, except that I have to invert it because it's selecting the bird, not everything around the bird. So invert it. I can either click on the properties panel where it says invert, or use Control-I. It inverted that mask. And now I can darken the surrounding. Of course, you notice that the mask has a very sharp edge. So go into, make sure you've got the mask selected, go into filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and you want a fairly high blur to blur that those sharp edges out. And actually, normally you would select the multiply blend mode. So at 100%, that's a pretty drastic vignette, but drop that down to 40% even. Nice subtle vignette, but it really makes the bird stand out.
Mhm.
So as mentioned, there's other things you can do, but that's pretty basic editing in terms of where I started in Photoshop. So this is what I brought in, essentially what I brought in from Lightroom, and that would be the finished image. So I'll just take another quick few minutes just to very quickly, for those that aren't familiar with Bridge, if you have Bridge, it is a great tool for quickly going through images. So I just stuck, these aren't actually out of the camera. This is a file where I've already selected the images and loaded them into Lightroom. But anyway, just because if I was out shooting birds this morning, I might have had 2,000 in here. I could show you how to do it. But so you've got a panel here that, first of all, as I mentioned, I import from the camera into a file on my laptop and then open that file in Bridge. So here's the images in that file. And I think it's under view. Yeah. You can either go up to view and review mode and click review mode, or just click Control B. And hopefully you can now see, kind of looks like a little carousel with one image in the front and a bunch more kind of in behind it. Hopefully that shows up on Zoom.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
So now if I use, and you won't be able to see this, but if I use my arrow keys, I can quickly go through those images using the right arrow key. If I use the down arrow key, it sort of drops that particular image out of the selection. So let's say I didn't want this one, let's say that's a reject, it drops it out. I can go along, maybe I don't want that one, maybe not that one, it's too busy. There's one where the background is really busy. You can barely see the bird, or two birds there actually. So I don't want that. And if I click escape without doing anything else, you can show now, or you can see now that the ones that I wanted, that I didn't drop out of the selection, those are still highlighted. The ones like that busy one there is no longer highlighted. So I've very quickly, first of all, had everything in that selection. I drop everything out of that selection that I don't want. And now with those images still selected, I can apply a rating to them. I can click on 6 for reject, or I can just say rate them all as a 1. And under ratings, oh, for some reason, oh, pardon me, yeah. Over on the left-hand side, you can see under ratings, it says, there's a line that says no ratings with a 4 after it. That means I dropped 4 images out of, so there's 4 images that are kind of rejects. I have 10 now that I've kept and I've rated as a 1. I could do the same thing, Control B, go through these again, drop some more out, and maybe the keepers raise the rating to 2 or whatever. Or I can now look at these at a larger size. If I actually just hit the space bar, it opens them up as a larger size. Same thing, I can kind of quickly go through them. And if I don't want this one, the number 6 creates a red flag on it, creates a reject, or calls it a reject. So I can quickly, again, very quickly go through these, rate them, whatever I want to do to them. Then at the end of the day, I can, if I want, I can go over here, I can pick the rejects, which is that one image. I can delete that from my laptop, so delete that completely. I can go into the ones with no rating, which is the ones I'd earlier eliminated. I can delete those off. And at the end of the day, then only be left with the images that I selected that I want to keep. And those are the ones that I import into Lightroom. So it gives you a very quick way of going through, to say, 2,000 images isn't unusual. So that is birds in a nutshell.